Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, Didi, yes.
Yes, Vipasa,
Okay.
you are.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this fourth lecture of Bishwabharati Young Scholars Lecture Series. It is my proud privilege to welcome you all here. Our speaker today is Dr. Amarendra Kumar from the Department of History, Vidya Bhavan. May I now request Dr. Sharon Ishika Maiti to please introduce Dr. Kumar. Sharon.
Thank you, Vipashadi. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Young Scholar Lecture Series is going to be hemmed by Dr. Amarendra Kumar, Associate Professor, Department of History, Bishwabharati. Dr. Kumar has joined Bishwabharati in the year of 2011. Before that, he served as an assistant professor for 11 years in National Defense Academy, Pune.
One request, please kindly mute yourself, others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shudabda. Dr. Kumar has earned his post-graduation degree as well as MPhil degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Later on, he did his PhD from Pune University. His subject specialization includes medieval Indian history, Maratha history. Also, his research interest encompasses history of warfare and diplomacy, pre-modern cartography, and cartographic practices. He has published several research articles in leading national journals and in edited volumes. He has successfully completed one major UGC research project. Of late, he has been working with a monograph on Maratha Navy. So apart from all these academic excellence, Amarendra has a penchant for Hindustani classical music. He is an accomplished Mohan Bina player. He had performed in radio as well. So that's all about Dr. Kumar. Just a short trivia I would like to share. Wherever and whenever we meet Amarendra, we always find him with a hovering smile. That's another USP of Dr. Kumar. So let me pass on the screen to Dr. Kumar for starting today's session. Dr. Kumar, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible and am I visible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
That's great. So I must thank the organizers, of course, for having started this wonderful lecture series and giving me an opportunity to, in fact, discuss and share some of my findings on Maratha Navy. So before I would, in fact, discuss all these things, let me first of all see to it whether my PowerPoint presentation also is visible. So, can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, visible.
Okay.
You may proceed.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, as the title, I'm sorry, I am just reminded of Sharon that my USP is smile. So even when I'm teaching, even when I'm lecturing, you may see a smile. That doesn't mean that I'm so confident. But the thing is, yes, that shows that I'm happy to share my views and my research findings with you. Right. So as the topic suggests, why Shivaji needed a navy? The first thing is why Shivaji? Why Marathas? The thing is because whenever we come across a statue of Shivaji, or whenever, in fact, the Bengal people, in particular, where our university is located, we think of the Marathas, we always see them as the horse rider and charging from the horsebacks. We never would, in fact, think that They could also, they had expertise in, you can say, mastering the waves of the sea. So there are several reasons. The basic thing is that why Shivaji needed. That is something is really intriguing. And this topic, in fact, has been very, very much dear to me, to my heart. And I have been doing my research for the last you can say almost 10 to 15 years on the Maratha Navy and the limitations, the challenges, the Maratha naval warfare, and of course, cartography of it. So, let us first of all see to it that what exactly we mean when we talk about the Navy. Now, as such, we find that Navy means it's the branch of the defense forces. And the first thing, when we talk about defense, uh, you know, defense first constitutes attack. Because what for are you defending? What are you in fact preparing for, waiting for? It is against an attack. So you also need to in fact fight back. You also need to have certain strategy to attack. So defense constitutes attack. That is my first thing that I would like. So Navy is a branch of defense force. And what is the use of the Navy? Of course, it is in fact to along the shore, along the territorial waters. Because the thing is, here the water, I am sorry, I have to just take a pause. I can hear some noise. If every participant would please mute himself or herself, that would be fine. Disturbing. I can hear some sound. So I would request everyone to just check whether your mics are accidentally turned on. Thank you. Right. So when we talk about Navy, of course, it means the fleet, the collection of vessels, which would be there to secure your coastal establishments and other waterways. It may be inside, that is the riverine waterways. It may be the high seas waterway. It may be the coastal waterways and different kinds of things. Yes. So as such, what we find is that Navy and the naval, you can say, establishment is to fight. It is equipped. It is trained to fight naval wars, neutralize threats, and of course they would have to have a kind of ammunitions, etc., like that. Now, this what I have said very briefly is a modern definition of Navy. Modern definitions means the basic change, I would say, because we are dealing with the medieval world, the pre-modern world, the basic change as far as the Navy, the naval structure, the naval warfare, that comes from, say, around 15th century, when we find that on the riverine or on the ocean-going vessels, you start putting the firearms, the cannons, right? So that's how the vessels are same. There is no design improvement at that point of time. But what you are doing is that you can enabling it with the teeth, with the firepower, so that you can fight and ward off the enemies in the course of your navigational route. So from 15th century, you know, what happens is that when the firearms, when the cannons, they were started, they were in fact being put on the ships. So gradually the ship designing and the structure of the ships also changed, because it is very difficult to aim, and because the guns have a big recoil. And when it recoils, because see, on the land you can hold something, but on the water it is very difficult to hold something. So there are so many technicalities. I'm not going into details, but what I am trying to suggest is one of the functions of the Navy that has been in the modern time is to fight wars through the firepower. Of course, there are other functions like conveying of the troops. For example, when we talk about the pre-modern and in fact pre-medieval or ancient period, we talk about the Chola Navy. But we do not have the references that the vessels used to fight wars on the sea on the water. What they were doing, they were transporting, in fact, the paintings, Ajanta paintings also would suggest that they are transporting the troops, including elephants, chariots, everything, and then they are going to fight on the land. So what I'm trying to suggest is, when we talk about Navy, in the modern sense, a Navy where the battle, the war is being offered on the high seas, on the water, not on the land, not just transportation, but it is actual fight. That is what we have to suggest. So it is in this parameter that we have to see Shivaji, who is a 17th century player, right? One more thing, why I have taken, I won't take time, but why I have taken this topic. Shivaji is, of course, very dear to me. My MPhil, my PhD, everything is on Maratha history. So here in Vishwabharati, I used to give lectures on Shivaji on his on his birthday, and with his 19th of February. This year, because of Corona, that could not happen. But I used to give. So 19th February, it has passed. So I was having an urge to speak on Shivaji. So this is a good time that I'm having. Plus, this month of April, in fact, in particular, 19th April, it is also the date is the death, you can say, anniversary of Shivaji. So that way, the April month, even if I am getting here, so I can justify that, yes, I can speak, and this is what I would like to say. That is the first thing. Second thing, this topic, of course, I did not know, because the thing was decided maybe 10-15 days back. But this topic becomes more relevant in the wake of the recent events, because the last point in the slide, what you can see is, I talk about the naval jurisdiction. And when we talk about naval jurisdiction, it is basically the territoriality over the water, the control over the water. We always think of control over land, but the kind of territoriality of the water, that is what we are talking about. Why I am saying this? Because just 1 week ago, on the 7th of March, one of the, you can say, the vessels, the ships, warships of the US 7th Fleet that is stationed at Japan, in fact, it has crossed into the Indian, you can say, naval jurisdiction unit in a naval territory. And America, in fact, the US, in fact, though it is supposed to be our ally, because we had the Quad exercise also in the last month, but they, in fact, are not bothered about the things, and they talk about certain laws. So the last point here is, what is that cannon shot versus UN clause? Cannon shot, I'll just tell you, because we are talking about the pre-modern period. We are talking about the Maratha period, that is the 17th century today. I'm just trying to confine myself with Shivaji. So during Shivaji's period, during the 17th century, rather, you can say, there was no such territorial jurisdiction over water. In fact, when the Portuguese came in 1498, they came, they conquered and they dominated because they had a better naval power. Their naval fleet was there. But somehow you can say that there was an attempt to define that territory over the sea, and that we find in the light of a treaty that was done in Europe, that is the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, in which Spain and Portugal, both of them, divided the entire globe into two halves, and that was their maritime jurisdiction was regarding that. That means it was the monopoly of either Spain or Portugal over the sea routes and over the sea. So of course, the other players like the Dutch, first of all, they did not in fact like this kind of control of the ship. And that is why what we find is there's a theorist called Hugo Grotius. And he in fact gave a kind of theory where he talks about the kind of the right over the coastal water. That is the jurisdiction, naval jurisdiction, right over the coastal waters. And then this was in 1604. And then it was in the 18th century, early 18th century, that there was another kind of theory that was again given by the Dutch theorist called Bijker Schock. And he propounded so-called the cannon shot rule. Cannon shot rule means at that time, at most, not like the howitzer and Bofors of these days. At that time, at most, the cannon would have fired up to 3 miles. So Banker-Schock, in fact, suggested that from the limit of the territory where it touches the range of the cannonball, that is 3 miles, that is the cannon shot, that should be treated as the territorial jurisdiction of the coastal country, that is the country which is abutting the sea. So that kind of a rule, in fact, 16, 17 and 18 century, they were trying to suggest. But again, this was never formalized, never finalized. In fact, it is still not finalized, let me tell you, except for one thing. So I'll just take 1 minute for UN clause. UN clause is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. Law of the Seas. So in this convention, of course, it was post-World War period that the nations thought of, rather you can say, decide about what do we mean by jurisdiction over the water, territorial jurisdiction. So that's why they came up with 3 basic kinds of rights over the territorial waters, and that the first was how much would be within the territory, that is the, you can say, territorial waters, and you all know it is 12 nautical miles. So 12 nautical miles is the territory over the sea from the coast, and then again adjacent 12 more miles, that would be your adjacent, you can say, control. And finally, up to 200 nautical miles, it was the EEZ, exclusive economic zone. And that is where I'm just referring to US ship of the 7th Fleet. They entered and they violated the Indian EEZ. That is the basic thing. Anyway, so what I am just trying to suggest that to understand the pre-modern, you can say, naval system, we have to keep into mind what was the system prevalent at that time and what is the system still prevailing. And let me tell you, this UN clause that was signed, this convention was signed in 1982. And it was ratified by most of the countries by 1995. India also is a country which has signed, but the US so far has not signed. We are not going to talk about it. Okay, let us come back. So having defined the Navy, having defined the jurisdictions and all these things, because it is very important. Why would you need to have a Navy? Because you need to have your jurisdiction. You need to have your control. So that is how we are going to. Okay, so coming to the point, direct point, and that is what was the Maratha surrounding? In what situation, under what circumstances was the Maratha ruler Shivaji, in fact, trying to have his navy, trying to create a navy and a naval establishment? So we find that the maritime surroundings of Swarajya, those who are studying history, I know many of my students, ex-students, they are also, in fact, they have joined. So one more thing I would like to suggest here. Yes, this is a topic of history, pure history, though relegated into footnotes. But I would like to, in fact, you can say, correlate this topic with the interdisciplinary, you can say, approach, like how geography becomes important, how physics, that is the kind of the theory of buoyancy, how the things float on the water, it becomes important, and how the environmental science, how the wood, teak, and all these things become important. So that way, I'm just trying to make you understand that how and why Shivaji, in fact, wanted this thing. So first of all, it is his maritime surroundings. And what is the maritime surrounding? That through his conquest, which is started as early as 1646, right? So he had, in fact, under his control, entire coastal stretch on the west, that is Arabian Sea, and that stretched from Bombay to Goa, and that is what we know as the Konkan coast. Now, when you have the coast, obviously the coast would have ports. Now, when the ports are there, trade, commerce, and economic, you can say, activities would be really on a very, very large scale. So, of course, that was the opportunity for Shivaji, because see, if you talk about Maratha, I'll just give you in one line the kind of geography of Maratha. It has two parts. One part is called Des and the one part is called the Konkan, and in between is the Sahyadri mountain ranges. So on the western part, that is the part which is called Konkan, which is hardly, you can say, 70 to 80 kilometers in, you can say, width, not more than that. That is very, very fertile. But beyond the Sahyadri on the eastern side, that is a rain shadow area, and that is very, very dry, the Desh area, and you come across so much of, you can say, Vidarbha region where the farmers commit suicide and all this things. It is all in that region where the agriculture and other kinds of activities are very, very less. So the resource constraint was there. So obviously Shivaji would have thought of, in fact, getting whatever he could from the commercial activities, right? Then the second thing is the assessment of threat. Yes, threat were there. Why? Because Shivaji, as we are saying, his ruling period, that was mid, you can say, 17th century, and by that time you all know Portuguese were 1.5 century old and they were decaying. But the new Iberian rulers, the Iberian countries have come, the joint stock companies have come, the Dutch had come, the English East India Company had come, and they are fiercely, fiercely competitive. That is one thing, mercantile, they are competitive in that sense. But at the same time, they also had a huge navy, they had navy backup, and with that only they could subdue the Portuguese, and they were also fighting amongst themselves. So that was the threat, commercial as well as the military threat. Then, what is the ground reality of Shivaji? When we talk about his territory, it is, of course, in the Maratha, the Deccan area, initially to start with. And at that time, the pressure was from the Mughals, and one of the greatest, you can say, Mughals, you can say, Aurangzeb. He was the contemporary of Shivaji. So obviously, the kind of pressure from the land side, and of course, the Bijapur, under whom earlier the Goa port was there, that was also the enemy. So they were constantly pushing Shivaji from the land side, and they were pushing him towards the sea. So what was the option before Shivaji? The option was to utilize the sea, to utilize the opportunity, to create this, you can say, option into benefits. So that is how the surroundings were like that. And then last but not the least, there was one internal enemy, and that is the Siddhi of Janjira. Siddhi were of Abyssinian race from, you can say, Ethiopia, and they were the military adventurers. And you already, if you have seen that movie Razia Sultan, the paramour of Razia was again a Siddhi, and Dharmendra played, and he was painted in black. So that is the kind of thing. But yes, they were the military adventurers. So one of the Siddhi was also there, and at Janjira was a kind of fort. We'll talk about that. So they had a fighting flotilla. They had a kind of naval presence there. So Shivaji was in fact sandwiched, you can say. From the seaside, the Europeans were there, the Siddhi was there, and from the land side, it was the Mughals and the Bijapur. So what Shivaji should do? So he should start thinking of all these kinds of options. Now, having said that, having talked about the background, so now what we would be talking about is what are the documentary evidences? Because see, in history, and of course in every other subject, we cannot about without the kind of documentation. So what kind of documentations are there? So as far as the Maratha, that is the Shivaji's period is concerned, we find that it is in fact the two contemporary authorities, which were in fact the contemporary authors of Shivaji. One was Krishnaji Anand Sabhasad, and he wrote the Sabhasad Bakhar. Bakhar is, of course, Bakhar is derived from the word khabar. Khabar means news and kind of story. So that is how whatever is happening, he is noting down, Krishnaji Anand Sabhasad. And Sabhasad means he's a courtier of Shivaji. So that is one of the most authentic sources. There he talks about the navy, its purpose. And then second is the Rajniti of Ramchandra Pant Amatya. Amatya again is one of the Ashtapradhan, that is one of the 8 ministers of Shivaji. So he later on, he wrote what he could see and how he felt about Navy. So these are the two contemporary Marathi documents. So we have the primary sources talking about the Maratha Navy, why it was created and how it was functioning. Then, as I said, Marathas were talking and fighting with the Mughals, with the Bijapuri. So we have the Mughal texts and all other official correspondences, which would talk about the kind of Maratha Navy, naval activities. And in particular, let me mention one of the most important contemporary sources, that is Hafi Khan. Right. Hafi Khan wrote Muntakhabul Lubab. In that, he devotes a chapter about the rise of Shivaji, the kind of potentials of Shivaji, and he also devotes many pages on the Maratha Navy. So that way, in fact, there are so many, in fact, the sources. Then we come across the contemporary European records. You all know that the English factories were there, the English factory records were there. Similarly, the Dutch factory records were there. Similarly, the French records were there. Francis Martin, François Martin, everyone knows, and he wrote how he acquired a Pondicherry from the Marathas. All exactly purchased. So all these records, so whatever we are talking about, it has a solid base. It is all you can say attested by the documentary evidences. Now, coming to the next thing, that what were the declared objectives of Shivaji? So of course he goes for a navy. So what is the thing? He says he has to fight. Remember my first slide, I said defense. When you are defending, you have to fight. So he says to fight the Siddhi of Janjira. So he is not talking about, very clearly, both the sources, Sabhasad as well as Amatya's Rajniti. They do not say that it is to fight the Europeans. Let me tell you why. Because, and that is the second point, that why Shivaji declared an objective. It is because at that time Marathas were lacking the teeth, that is the gun, that is the firepower, and it was only the Europeans who were in such a position to have supplied them, supplemented their this kind of drawback, this kind of weakness. So that is why it is never overtly said, it is never clearly said that he wanted to fight against the Europeans. And that is why even when he is having his you can say fights and you can say naval skirmishes with the Europeans, it's not going to a next level. It is simply somewhere where both the sides talk, and in fact it tries to fulfill his political objectives. I'll elaborate upon it later on. So that's why the declared objective is Siddhi of Janjira. So his declared enemy is the Siddhi. He says, I am going to fight the Siddhis. Please help me, because he is a menace. Right. Then when he does that, then what you see, you come across many coastal as well as offshore, that is island strongholds. So when you are having a navy, you would have a base. Like for your air force, you have to have the air base where everything could be done, fitted, repair and everything. So for that also you need to have those kinds of coastal and offshore strongholds, bases. Take the case of Kolaba, right? Take the case of Sindhudurg and so many other forts. We come across so many names which acted as the bases and strongholds where the naval vessels could be in fact placed, they could be kept, they could be hauled ashore so that they should be protected properly. Shipbuilding center. Of course, there are so many, and the first, in fact, the Portuguese records, in fact, tell us in 1657, they tell us that in the region of Kalyan Bhiwandi, Kalyan is just a suburb of Bombay, Mumbai. So there, where the tidal waters reached to that level, there he started his boat building sites, and this was in fact an area which was under the Portuguese dominance. So he would take the passes, the permission from the Portuguese to set out into the sea, because this is way beyond the sea, it is well inside the territory. So that is how he is trying to have good relations, in fact, with the Portuguese. And needless to say that some of the designs and some of the arms equipments also came from the Europeans, particularly the Portuguese. Okay, so that is how he was starting his things. Now, as I said, I would in fact also talk about the other considerations. Why? So let us talk about the science behind the naval crafts. It is not that when you see a navy, when you see a boat, it is simply like that. It has to have certain principles. For example, what I have written here is types of naval vessels. Which particular features? You may note, and I'm going to explain it right now. Small and medium sized for less dependence on wind. So here, the Amatya Rajniti, it suggests that Rajniti is the, you can say, a kind of a political document as if a state order. And it says that ships of medium and small sizes should be built so that they should not be dependent on wind. Now, when we talk about wind, you have already seen the poster, the beautiful poster for this talk, which has been prepared by the artists of the Kala Bhavan. So you find the sails are there, right? Ships sail. How would they sail? They would sail as per the wind velocity, right? Many a times they would not sail against the wind. Many a times they would sail through tacking movement, they would sail. But the point here I'm trying to suggest is that Maratha policy was, or Shivaji's policy was clearly underlining that ships should not be dependent on wind. That means what? It's a very, very important thing, and that is what the next B point is written. It was suited for the coastal surroundings, because on the coast, near the coast, the wind velocity is less. And when the wind velocity is less, what happens is that the maneuvering of the ships, which are dependent on huge sails, and I'll show you the photographs also, some pictures also, paintings also, so don't worry. So that becomes difficult. It cannot move. And once it cannot move, once it cannot maneuver, then what would happen? That it would be useless. It could be attacked by the rowing vessels. So what we find is the Maratha vessels were in fact having both the kinds of, you can say, advantages. One advantage was that they were rowing vessels, and at the same time they also had the sails. In fact, iconographic evidences in the deep south also have found that many of the Indian ships, the coastal ships, had both the rowing, you can say, technique also, as well as the sails also. So that is all suited, because when there is a wind, you can make use of that, and when you can go out, then of course you can use the rowing things. Okay, so arming and design we have talked about. So we talked about vessels of different types. So let us talk about three important types of vessels of the Marathas. And these types I'm talking about is, and you can find from the photograph, we'll talk about also, it is mast. You can see the kind of this, if you can see my cursor, this pole in the center, almost in the center of the ship, this is called the mast, through which the sail is furled. So this sail is lateen sail. It is not a square sail, and it is, you can see, almost perpendicular to the this is what the trigonometry, geometry, and everything is included here. So the thing is, mast, it depends. So that was in fact the single mast, and this is called galbat, right? Galbat. English, of course, you will find galleys and all, but they were bigger than this, but maybe kind of corrupt version of galley. And then the second, which I'll show you later, that was of two masts, that is called Gurab. And this picture you can see here, it is having three masts. You can see one flag, two flag, three flag, one pole, two pole, second pole, and the third pole. So there are three masts. So of course these are the bigger vessels, and these can catch more wind. So if you can see that in the very first thing, what you can see, there is a sail, and this is what? This is the rowing, you can say, things. So you have the pedals also. You can do this, and you have the sail also. But when we talk about the bigger ship, there is nothing called the things. It is only the sail, which is coming. Again, I'm sorry, someone is speaking. Okay, so that is how the sail. So here you can see, and there's no row. It is only dependent on the ship. So 3 masts. This is called pal. Pal. Pal means pal. Noka. Wala pal. Okay. There are some contemporary paintings. You might be able to find something, different types of one single mast, double mast, triple mast. So this is how I have tried to gather, and these are all. And on the left here, I can see, bottom left, you can see there is in fact you can say a coastal fort which can be seen, and inside the structure can also be seen, and the ships near that can be seen. So that way, the paintings also suggest so many things. We'll talk about the paintings more. In fact, when we talk about Marathas, and I gave you the example of the Cholas, I may be in fact branded that I am pro-Maratha, but the fact remains that Marathas were the first rulers to have had a kind of navy which in fact performed the functions of a navy similar to what we can see these days. So here I am showing you one of the commemorative stamps that was issued in 2001, and this is of a Galbat. Here it is written also, the Galbat. It is a single mast ship. 2001, I remember, though I missed that event that was held in Bombay, the International Fleet Review. But at that time, I was posted at the National Defense Academy, and many of, in fact, our colleagues had gone to witness that. But the thing is, see, when you are commemorating, what kind of ship? It is not the Chola ship, it is the Maratha ship that is coming. In fact, one more. Here, it is PAL. You can see the 3 masts here. So the government of India also recognizes, at that time also it recognized that yes, the Marathas in fact had this kind of a navy. And what I talked about in the beginning, that see, we do not even have any idea that Marathas had such a huge naval kind of setup. It is just relegated to footnotes in some of the Maratha texts, and in the mainstream history texts, you won't even come across just, okay, Shivaji also founded a navy. That is the thing. So anyway, so these are the kinds of things that how we can correlate the 300-old history of the Maratha navy. Okay. Coming back to the things, after having shown you some photographs, again, I'll show you photographs, don't worry about that. I have so many, there are so many slides, so if it continues for a bit long, I'll just try to finish up. Okay, assimilation of geographical realities of the Konkan coast. I talked about what is the Konkan coast. Konkan coast is from Bombay to Goa. So what is the geographical reality? That is what we have to talk about. There is a difference, the geography people know, between the eastern coast and the western coast. Because eastern coast, there are huge rivers, long rivers, they are draining out into the sea. But on the western coast, we do not have such things. They are very, very fast flowing steep streams, not even 50 miles of length. That could be called a kind of a river. And it is in fact very rocky. But that's good that it has very good, you can say, shelter. The bays are good, the shelter is good, and there it is having many spurs. So it is not a very regular kind of plain kind of coast. It is broken with many inlets inside. Of course, geography students and geography people would understand. There's so many inlets. That is what we call creeks, coves, where the water is shallow, and where, as we have seen, the policy, the Maratha naval policy is to have small boats, medium-sized boats, not dependent on wind. They could be rowed up to these kind of safe shelters if you have disengaged, right? So you can go back. Then the third thing is sandbars. You all know sandbars. You know why it is very important? Because Shivaji understood all these things. Sandbars, because when the river is flowing, when it is going to meet the sea, it carries along with the fluvial soil, the flood soil. And because of that, at the mouth of the river, where it is meeting the sea, there is a kind of very, very shallow, you can say, water. And that is what is called sandbar, which is very, very difficult to close. So within the sandbar, it is a deep water, but without that sandbar, it is from outside, the bigger vessels would not be able to enter the inside. So that is again one advantage. So sandbars and submerged rocks. Remember, I talked about cartography. That is what I am trying to see. at that time in the 16th, 17th century, the coastal features were not properly studied. It was not the era of the lighthouses of the present days. So those who were local, those who were the coastal people, they only knew what exactly was the coastal bed. What exactly could you find near the coast? So that is how he would assimilate those realities and try to drag the enemy towards those areas, dangerous zones, where their ships would be aground. They would not be in a position to move. So that is the kind of, you can say, war tactics. So that is what we have said. The selection of sites for the naval forts. So again, the sites, when we talk about naval forts, there were three types of forts. Again, I'm just simply saying, because it's not that all the forts are the same. Three types of naval forts. One, of course, is the coastal fort, which is along the coast, that is touching the water. One is the headland or the promontories, again, geography people, on the high, from where you can see the bay, where you can control movement of the ships. And the third is the island fort, which would be there in the island, like Janjira. I'll just show very quickly. I'm going to show all this kinds of thing. So selection of naval forts, I'll just give you one example. One contemporary French traveler had come to India in 1672. His name was Abbé Carré, a French traveler, and he said Shivaji's forts were very well placed, means very well located. They were very easy to defend and very difficult to attack. This is what a French traveler, remember, a traveler does not mean to talk about the strategy and all this thing, but he could see the coastal fort. He is mentioning in 1672 that this is what is the nature, this is what is the selection of the sites, that it is difficult to attack, and from there it is in fact very easy to defend. So that is again. And last but not the least, here when we talk about the actions, the action was within the sight of the coast. That is what we talked about. It would be near the coast, where the water wind velocity would be less and the water would be shallow, where the bigger European ships, because see, Europeans actually were the main enemies. They had come across the ocean, they have crossed those oceans and come here. So their ships were not small ships, they were big, huge ships. So they needed the kind of space, they needed kind of depth of water. That was not very, very easy. And last but not the least, one more thing I just forgot, later on I had mentioned, that is the tidal pattern. Lots depended on tides. So those who are along the coast, they would understand what does tide mean. How through the tide you can locate, you can in fact control your movement. I'll just tell you one example for the history students. When we talk about the Harappan civilization, we talk about the Lothal port, the Lothal dockyard. Very few of you might be knowing that it was a tidal dockyard. That means the entry into this port would be with the high tide, because the water would be more and the ships would be there. And when they are going to make an exit, again, it would be during the tide that they would make an exit. So that is what is called tidal port. So tides, in fact, you can say control the movement of the ships. Okay, now again, the photographs. So that is what you must be waiting for, that I am just doing only lecturing. So what I have presented here is a kind of a specimen of a kind of a coastal fort. That is the fort, that means land and sea, both are meeting. So that is coast, and from there at that point we have a kind of a structure of fortification, and that is there to control and monitor the activities of the ships, your ship, friendly ships, as well as the enemy ships, anything. So this is just one of the examples. You can see nothing more. If you can see, it would only be, it's not a fort jahan pe Raja Rani and all these people would be staying. This is just for the garrisoning. This is just a kind of a front line of defense. It is not the main line of defense, front line. If you could contain the enemy there, so far so good. Otherwise you relay the message and you get the reinforcement. So that is one of the views of the coastal fort. And let me tell you one thing, those who are interested in military history, or you can say in these kinds of coast and structures, a retired Air Force officer, Wing Commander M.S. Narwane. He had in fact taken, he has written a very good book in which the aerial survey. Now, thankfully, we have drones, but we do not have that kind of a, you can say, money to hire those drones. But those aerial surveys would make, in fact, clear that what purpose did these naval fort serve. Okay, so let us go. Again, this is another kind of an example. You can see the coast is very near, and you can see the rampart, the bastion. If you can see, there's one man standing over here also. That is what you can see. So what is there? You can see here the gun ports, these holes where my cursor is there. This is the gun hole where the guns would be kept. What for? It would be for the firing. And this is the kind of a height from where you can fire for a longer range. So that is a bastion. That means the forts, the coastal forts, I'm not saying all of them were built by Shivaji, but he got them under control and he made the best use of them. And whatever guns, cannons he could plunder from the Mughals or from the Bijapurs, they would all be put either on his vessels, ships, or on his forts. So this is one of the bastions. This is how he tried to defend. Here it is when we talked about the Siddhi of Janjira. Can you see? This is amazing, fantastic, and I've been there. And this is something which you can say awesome. I mean, this is a huge structure where you can find, and I don't know, someone is doodling on my thing. Okay, so there's a huge structure, and you can see this is an island fort, the example of an island fort. You can see within the premises, the area, of course, this has fallen into disuse, but here the rulers, the Siddhi, let me tell you, he did not have any coastal base. Poor chap, he was totally on this, and his main job was depredation on the sea, on the traffic, and coastal trading. So that was the Siddhi of Janjira. I'll give you one more view of the Siddhi of Janjira's, this Janjira fort. You can see from within the fort, you can see the coast also, and you can see the distance. This distance is more than enough to defend himself, to be safe. And this green body, which you can see here, is the water body. Of course, 300 years and no one is drinking water from there, but this was the place which supplied water for the entire garrison, for the entire fort, and it would sustain for I don't know how many months. So, and here again you will find these bastions. Here the bastions are there, and the guns. Next photograph I'll show the guns also. See here, there is one gun you can find where my cursor is. I hope you can see. From the left, it is the second thing. Okay, so this is the wall of the fort, and you can see, have an idea, this is a small boat, and this is the kind of ladder. So how would you go? How would you go inside the fort? You have to have scaling ladders to climb. But can you climb? Because it's not only the cannons. Here also you can say on the fort, we have the cannons. Everywhere the cannons are fitted. Plus you have those rocks being put from the top. So, and see, ladder, you have to hold the ladder. If someone climbs the ladder, you have to hold. It has to have a base. How can a boat which is on the water, which is floating, hold this kind of things? Think of it. So this is the kind of interesting thing. Siddhis were invincible. Marathas could not, in fact, the British also could not defeat the Siddhis. Later on, it became a part of the British, you can say, principality. Okay. In reply to these forts, Shivaji, in fact, laid foundation of his own fort, and that is what we know as the Sindhu Durg. Sindhu means oceans, and Durg is fort. Let me tell you one thing, a very interesting aspect, that when we talk about the forts of Maharashtra, the forts are Garh. Garh is the hill forts. Killa or Killa, that is the plain forts or the coastal forts. And Durg is the naval fort, right? That is what you can have a difference when we talk about the fort. So whenever there is a Durg, then it would be mostly, at times you can also have some kind of jungle forts, but there are very, very few. But Durg is basically fun. So see, Shivaji also, he knew the importance of an island base. So what he did, he laid foundation in 1664 of a huge naval fortress, and that he christened as Sindhudurg, that is the ocean fortress. And still we have the we can find the hand impression of Shivaji, because he is said to have participated in the construction of this fort. So what I am trying to suggest, this is what Shivaji, he understood the surroundings. When we talked about in our slide, the coastal surroundings. So this is the surrounding, the Janjira. So what he has to do, he has to have his own Janjira. So that is what he is doing. So Sindhudurg fort. Then there is another fort called Khanderi Fort. You can see again here, see, this is the water body. And what is this? This is a fortified rock, but still you can see the bastions. Why would he fortify this kind of rock? You know why? And the things, even British fought hard to take this rock. It is hardly 2 miles in total circumference, less than that. Still it was important. Why? Because this fort commanded the entry to the Bombay harbor, the English East India Company's main trading port. So that is, see, a rock, any kind of rock which is appearing in the sea, and Shivaji is just trying to fortify. Why? He did not go mad. This is what is the strategy. This is how he would put pressure. And see, here the water is available. See, you can see, this is the water body, right? This is the kind of satellite image I just tried to say. See, here it is, that this fort is there. And if you go to this direction, where my cursor is going, you will reach Bombay. So here, if any ship is coming from this direction or from this direction, they would all be under the range. Remember, 3 miles, Binker shock. He had said 3 miles is your range, so you would always have. So think of it. This is one rock, and because of that, later on the English and the Siddhi, they also, if you can see, Undari is written. There was again a smaller, you can say, rock where only the rats, Undir in Marathi is called rat. So where only rats resided or rats lived, that was fortified by the British. Why? To have a kind of a counter measure, so that Khanderi could be challenged. Here it is Kolaba. Again, this is a kind of a coastal fort. And you can see here the fort is, and here the inner, you can say, river that is coming out. So all these kinds of things, they are always under the control of the navigation is basically under control. This is the Padma Durga. Padma is lotus. So I am sitting in the Padma Bhavan, so lotus building. So you can see this is again something which is an island fort which was built by Shivaji. So why is he building? There is a structure, there is a reason. And see how elaborate arrangements are there. So this is something where the ships would be there stationed, and they would in fact chase out the enemy ships or any kind of fight they could offer. They would not allow them to cross or pass through this. Okay, now again, there is another part of photographs, but I think within 10 minutes I would be completing my, you can say, presentation. So having seen all these kinds of photographs, paintings and all, what we should in fact think of is what kind of principles of warfare. Remember, Shivaji was first and foremost a military warrior, right? He had created his empire by fighting. So what kind of principles were followed by Shivaji? That is what the thing is. So the most important thing is, and that is what I had been teaching to my students, like in the first battle of Panipat, when Babur chose the city of Panipat, the field of Panipat, and he waited for the enemy. So here also, you draw the enemy towards a place where you would be confident to give a kind of war, to offer war. Don't go out because you know your limitations. You have to work upon your limitations and convert it into your strength. So what you are doing, you are trying to see the place of engagement. So how you are doing? So it should be near the coast. It should be as per the tidal pattern, right? And it should be the concentration of numbers, vessels. That is, and I have some photographs, paintings of the wars also. That means you have smaller vessels, so you have more numbers. So the enemy would find it difficult to, in fact, target each and every one at the time. If you have one or two, it would be easily targeted. Enemy had one big ship, but you have hundreds small ships. So you would be from all the sides trying to board and capture the enemy ship. So again, that is concentration of numbers. That is one of the most important principles of warfare. Then boarding action, that is what I said, that someone or the other, they would succeed in climbing. That is how the thing is, because numerically they are superior. Even if they are small, they would climb the ships of the enemy. Most important thing is disengagement during the action. So you know till what time you can fight, and that is what is the beauty of the guerrilla warfare. You fight at a time and at a place of your choice. And once you decide you are not interested in fighting, you simply retreat. I told you numerous bays and coves. Go and take shelter. So disengagement is one of the most important aspects which we've come across in so many instances recorded by the Europeans. So we are not going to talk about all these things. So disengagement is one. And then different vessels. I talked about the theories of floating, that is the hydraulics. So as we said, as we discussed, that the Amartya says, the Sabhasad says that the ships of having flat bottoms, you know, when you have the flat bottom, they would go fast. If you have the round bottom, they would draw more water and they would be heavier and it will be difficult to control. For the small flat bottom, easy to gain speed, easy to apply brake. So that is how the flat bottom, which would be easily afloat and it could be maneuvered very properly. Okay. Again, the last part of my, you can say, presentation, I am just withholding some of the things. If there is any question, then I would be talking about that. So see, this is the first, and this is what you exactly saw in the stamp which was issued by the government in 2001. This is one of the Galbat, which is single mast. And of course, what I would, it is not simply that picture. Just do not forget to see here where my cursor is. What you find here is one of a cannon which is placed. Can you see the cannon? Here some kind of smoke is also being shown, right? So what we are saying, that if you have bigger ships, you would need more, you can say. Here one cannon, if there are 10 or 15 galbats with cannons, they can be placed at 15 different points against the enemy ship, and they can fire in the bottom, in the hull of the enemy ship, and the enemy ship would be, you can say, disabled. So that is how, what he was doing. The basic thing was simply put one cannon, small crude kind of cannon, on the floating vessels, go there. It is something, if I am not exaggerating, it is something like Hitler did during the Second World War, his Luftwaffe, that is his air force. What were there? They were simply flying machines over which the machine guns were in fact placed, and they could not fly for more than 90 minutes. They had to come down for refueling, and there were no cannons. Upar mein bichara, the person who is there, he had to take aim and he had to shoot. So it is the similar kind. I would say Hitler might have been impressed by Shivaji, because this is what the principle of war is there, that you are placing your firepower and you are trying to use it to the best you know. Here I told you, you can see here there are two masts, one mast here and this is one mast here. Of course, these are not of Shivaji's time, these are of some later period, 18th century. But here what you find, here what you find is, see, in the front, this front part is called beak or prow, where I can see the flag is there, beak of a bird or prow. There you have this kind of cannon. At the back also you have cannon, because this is a bigger ship. This is Gurab. And you have sideway, that is called broadside, that you have these cannons. So it seems that the cannon, this is what is called deck, where you can see and you can find the things we'll talk about. So where we find that on the bigger ships we have this kind of arrangement, and this is how the cannons were being used. Here there's a you can say you see here the kind of contrast between Gurab, that is 2-mast ship, and Pal, 3-mast. In the background is the Pal. You say it is double deck cannon, first deck and second, like you have the 2-storied or 3-storied building. It is similar like that. So the bigger the ship, the bigger would be the you can say the more stories it would be. So it is like that. So you can see and this is where you can see this is the beak and this is the prow, the extending portion from where these all things would be controlled. I'll show you one more thing. This is one of the rare pictures of the Maratha period, and here this is a fort called Vijayadurg Fort. Here, what you find here at the bottom side, this is from the fort side, and you can see the Maratha ships going inside the bay, inside the creek. They are coming to the harbor. So this is the kind of bird's eye view that you are seeing your ships getting safe into your harbor. And here you can find this is a Pal, 1, 2, and 3 masts are there. The cannons could also be seen, and this is probably a kind of Galbat where one can be seen. So this is how you can see, and here also you can see on the rampart of the you can say bastion of the fort. Probably these are the cannons, right? So this is how the forts and the ships, they are combined together. In fact, Sabhasad Bakhar, if I may quote him, he says that Shivaji, of course, he was a good horseman. He said he saddled the sea by uniting the ships and the sea forts. He saddled the sea by uniting the ships and the sea fort. This is the kind of philosophy of Shivaji, how to saddle the sea. Okay, here it is. When we talk about science and technology, there is one 18th century picture that you can see on your screen. Here I have shown that there are certain scientific instruments. You can see this person on the deck sitting and probably having a kind of a telescope who is seeing. And this person who is a Tandel, he is trying to maneuver this kind of strings, because you know furling and unfurling of the you can say the masts and of course those kinds of sails is very, very much important, because it's not always that you are always being supported by the wind. You need to see to it how you can sail close to the wind by adjusting the angles, and that is what the naval people show. In this picture you can see here this person is also holding probably something, and this is to see the balance, and of course they also take the depth, that how deep at that point of time is the sea, because at the time of tide, that is the high tide and the neap tide, what is the difference, so that they can have their strategy of warfare. And interestingly, see one of the coastal fort, right now I have said, see there it is, Yashwantgarh, that is what is written here. So this is a fort, it's a coastal fort, not a island fort. And this is Bandar Vengurle, that is the port of Vengurla on the western coast. And this is Moje Dabholi. Dabhol was one of the ports also, and this port was very important. And then Moje Kelushi. So all these ports, all these villages along the coast, they are now getting in fact recorded in the 18th century records. Still we have very, very few maps, and 2 of the maps are there in French library. One of my professors of JNU who had gone there, so I had requested him to let me know about those things. So I have come to know more about that. So what I'm trying to suggest is that Marathas were not lagging behind. They were using all the kinds of experiments to make their navy a viable thing. Now here you can see depiction of a naval fight, and you can find the bigger ones, the huge ones. It's kind of a thing, David versus Goliath. That is what you all know, the kind of war. So the huge ones, this is where you can find, these are all the European ships, and these are all the Maratha ships. And you can see the number of people. Some of would swim, some of would go, and their basic purpose is to uh, get hold of the enemy ship and just go over it and have a hand-to-hand fighting. Here, one more concept I would like to suggest here. If you see this picture very clearly, again, this depicts a fight between the Europeans, and you can see the kind of dimensions of the ship. That's what I'm saying. And see, the one which is near to the coast, see their sail. There is simply just like, unfolded, and the ones which are deeper into the sea, their sails are very, very fully shown. And here it is that these are the Maratha people. If you could see it closely, in their hands you can see there are guns. Even on the European ships, you have the people having their guns. They have in fact gun ports on the broadside, but these guns are also there. What I wanted to suggest here is that, see the color composition here. This is brown and this is here blue. So brown water and blue water. Brown water basically means the coastal surroundings where the shallow water is there, and blue water means the deep sea, where which would be, you can say, very, very much suited for the navigation of the bigger ship. So this is how all these things are there. So there are so many references which would be suggested that yes, they knew and they made a very, very well calculated use. So anyway, as a conclusion, when we talk about whether Shivaji's navy, whether it was an intuitive act or a well-considered choice, I, in fact, as far as my study goes, I would always recommend strongly that yes, it was a well and very well considered choice, and that has to be seen from the documentation of the non-Marathas of that period. Yes, commercial endeavors, yes, that is also there. Why he needed it is not only just for fight, it is to protect the interests. And unless until you protect your commerce, remember the Portuguese, the Cartas Kafila system, we all in history, we know that they in fact brought about this kind of Cartas system, pass system, the kind of security system. So that is what is required. Marathas also issued their passes. Shivaji also issued his passes. Well, if you have to navigate, like you have the toll taxes, you have to pay the toll taxes. How would you enforce, unless and until you have a naval kind of system? The thing is, whether it was a far-sighted approach in view of the European penetrations, I would say, given the kind of caliber of Shivaji, given the kind of, you can say, the genius he was, I would say the kind of things that the Europeans were in fact gradually getting into. And I would in fact here like to caution my history students and history followers that we must not see the activities of those commercial companies like the British East India Company or the Dutch as simply commercial. We always tend to make a mistake. I repeat, make a mistake by saying it is only Plassey, the Battle of Plassey of 1757, that the company became a political power. I would rather suggest no. It was even during the time of Shivaji that the company intended to become a political power, intended to control the territory, and we have so many references, in fact, including, you all know, Bombay, how Bombay was, in fact, taken by the English. It was given as a dowry to Charles, and then Charles handed it over to the British. But for that, it took 5 years. The Portuguese were not handing it over. So the English company was contemplating of attacking Bombay and capturing it. So in fact, they also, their correspondences suggest that they also wanted to take control of Janjira, the fort which I thought the strongest of the fort. So it's not that their intentions started only after Sirajuddaula came. No, it was already there. But yes, at that time only they succeeded. Till the time the Marathas were there, the British could not, in fact, go ahead and have their naval mastery. Last but not the least, alternative escape route in case of mounting pressure from land. Yes, it was alternative escape route also. For example, if the Marathas, sorry, if the Mughals, if the Bijapuris, if they could come ahead, and if they could, in fact, what you can say, put pressure on Shivaji, Shivaji had an alternative to escape into the sea, go to his coastal fort or the you can say island fort, and then try to regroup and take his things back. So with that, I conclude my talk, and I'm sorry that I have in fact exceeded my time limit, but I hope it was quite clear to you. And if you have any questions, particularly relating to the Shivaji's period, you are most welcome. And with your permission, I'll have some water. Thank you, Vipashadi.
Thank you, Amarendra. Now may I ask Dr. Shudev to take over?
Thank you, Amarendra. Thank you, Vipashadi. So we already have 2 questions on the chat box, which I will ask Amarendra to address. Amarendra, it was a brilliant lecture, brilliant presentation with all the new kinds of support that we are taking for granted, the PowerPoint, the interesting aerial photographs. I also have 2 questions which I'll add later on. So let's begin with the first question from Naju Hasda. As we know that Shivaji in his whole life fought mostly against the Mughal forces, and he had mastery over field warfare. So did he get any benefits during the fights against the Mughals by creating the naval force?
Okay.
Babil.
Okay.
Babil.
So, thank you for this question, Naju. When we talk about
Just a minute, Amarendra. I think Shondipda is trying to say something.
Yeah.
Yes,
Shudev,
because
Shudev.
I'm not feeling well. That's why I would just like to say something as quickly as possible. Amarendra, you have done. Could you listen to me, Amarendra?
Yes, sir.
So you have done excellent presentation. I have 2 clarification. One, after Shivaji, that is after 1680, it was Kanauji Angria who took the charge of entire navy on behalf of Tarabai and controlled the entire western coast. This is number 1. Secondly, what about the vernacular sources? Could you find anything from the Fukazawa's work, Medieval Deccan, speaking of anything, the necessity of having the Maratha Navy? And thirdly, although at the fag end you referred to Kafila and Carthage reference, but throughout the 1600, 1500, the Estado India established firmly based on Goa as their main seat of political power. And it was also some of the important policy decisions. Even the Mughals, the Akbar as well as Jahangir and Shah Jahan, they never wanted to destabilize the situation, and they accepted the Carthage and Kafila system. So this is all about some of the observations. Thank you, Amarendra. Well done.
Thank you, sir. So do you want me to respond, sir? I don't think it is just an observation.
Pardon?
You want to respond, me to respond, or is it just an observation, sir? I think it is just an observation.
Yes, yes. At the end, you can take the questions from everyone, and then you say.
Yes. Thank you very much, sir. Okay. So now coming to Naju Hasda's question, and he says that Shivaji mostly fought against the Mughals, and he has mastery over field warfare. So how did he get benefits? So that is what Naju, you have been a student of this department. I would rather suggest that, see, when we talk about the Siddhi of Janjira was a very dangerous person, and he was known to have, in fact, shifted his loyalty. What happens during the time of Shivaji, when Shivaji applied pressure, and that is there in all the contemporary sources, including the English, and that's why the English wanted to take Janjira. fact, Shivaji applied pressure on the Siddhis. In fact, Siddhi, for some time, Siddhi was actually a noble of Bijapur. He was serving the Bijapur Sultan. Then he changed his masters and he came under Portuguese for some time. But the Portuguese could also not give him that kind of safety and security against the Marathas, particularly Shivaji, because he was hell-bent to destroy Siddhi. And that is why it was in 1672 that for sure there is a reference that this Siddhi of Janjira joined the Mughals, and Aurangzeb immediately made him the admiral of the Mughals in the western coast. So that is how enemy's enemy becomes your friend. So yes, after that it is all a kind of fight between the Siddhi, who was representing the Mughals, and Siddhi also could very interestingly take advantage of his, you can say, attachment or his association with the Mughals, because he could make use of the British facilities, the British harbors and other things, because the British were trading from Surat and they in fact needed to make Aurangzeb happy. So yes, he had a benefit, and Siddhi was in fact really cornered by Shivaji, let me tell you. He could not, without the help of the English, the Siddhi could not have survived. Yes. Next question.
Thank you, Amarendra. The next question comes from Shashwata Bhattacharya. Dada, can we find any evidence of direct confrontation between Shivaji and the Europeans? Can you comment something on the recruitment policy of naval soldiers, and who were the specific officers in the Navy?
Okay. So when we talk about direct evidences, yes, there are plenty. And plenty means, let me talk about, as far as the Marathi sources is concerned, there also the Amatya and Sabasad mentions that Shivaji fought against 27 nations, including the hat wearers, Golandaj, Valandaj, the Dutch and Firangis and all. So yes, it is there, but not specific battles. But yes, in the Portuguese, yes, in the European, the English records, yes, we have. In fact, they are always talking about the things. What is happening? Let me tell you, Shashwata, one thing, that whenever this kind of a conflict arose, as in the beginning I mentioned, that it would never go beyond a kind of a limit. He had in fact set a kind of a level that it should not escalate beyond that. So what would happen? That they would siege each other's ships, right? But when the ships are sieged, what is happening is that a very meticulous detail is being prepared as to what all is the, you can say, are the things which the ship was carrying and everything, so that with that they would have a kind of discussion and that kind of a bargaining thing. So yes, we had so many references, but it would never get out of hand, because the English also knew that ultimately if they have to trade in the coast or in the hinterland, they have to in fact take the you can say willing consent of the local rulers. Now the second thing, when you said as far as the officials is concerned, that is the first thing. So yes, there was a recruitment policy when we talk about, and what was the recruitment policy? As I have shown you the slides also. For example, you know, the person who is climbing on the masks, the last slide I showed, the colored slide, they would be, you know, would be the caste of the toddy tappers, the Bhandari caste, who were very, very good at climbing those kinds of palm trees. So they would be there and they would be seeing and giving the kind of information that what they could see, what is the kind of weather, whether there is any enemy ship and all these things or not. So that is how, in fact, there is a caste called Kharavi, Daladi. So they are good, you can say, divers. So if they dive karne wale, if there is a kind of leakage or kind of a problem during this thing, then they would go and fix those kinds of leakages. So what is happening is the coastal population, it is already there in the Gazetteer of Bombay Island and all. So 3 volumes are there. The coastal population, they are the ones, the coolies. In fact, the ships of the coolies called Manchua, M-A-N-C-H-U-A in the English records. They are also being used. That is what I told. And I showed you the Galbats. You just place one cannon and it would be there. It is kind of a total war for the Marathas. So yes, there was a thing, and the main official that was the one who was in charge. I talked about that entire naval unit. It consisted of almost 400 ships. That is what is as per the contemporary evidences. English records also suggest 160. A person is writing, I saw from my own eyes that more than 160. So they were divided into 2 administrative units, right? Circles. So there were 2 centers, one in the north, Kulaba, and the other in the Sindhu. So that is how it was done. And the topmost official of one naval suba was called the Sarang or the Darya Sarang, right? He was the naval commander. So Darya Sarang, that was happening. So yes, we have so many officials, but not much details are handed over to us of the period of Shivaji as far as the names of officials. You can find the names in Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, and I believe he also talks about Sarang, so Tandales and all. So I think they are the same people who are also being employed. Right.
Okay, thank you, Amarendra. This is, I think, the last question as of now from Shulabh Kormokar. Dada, is there any war fought by the Navy of Shivaji Maharaj, and what was the special strategy used by him when he used to take the Navy?
Right. War, I showed you the picture of the Khanderi rock, and I told you it is less than even 2 miles as far as the entire area is concerned. And I told you that the British tried their best. They attacked, but they could not during the time of Shivaji. I'm not talking about Kanoji Angre, as Sandipta said. It was during the time of Shivaji and the period. You can find that if you read Jadunath Sarkar, he also makes a mention. That is called Battle of Khanderi Underi. Right? 1679 is just before Shivaji's death, which continued for more than a month, but the British, and they record also, they could not go nearer to the fort because of the fear of the submerged rocks, because they had not charted the kind of the seabed, the soundings were not taken, everything is dealt with in a very, very specific manner. So yes, during Shivaji's time, naval battles were fought, and particularly the battle for the Khanderi Island, 1679, right? Sudev, you are not audible. Sudev, can you unmute yourself?
Right, thank you. Thank you, Amarendra. This is from, the next question comes from Sudipto Chatterjee. Sir, thank you for a nice lecture. I want to know from you that the naval strategy of Shivaji Maharaj was an output of the Mughal Bijapuri pressure, or to create a counter pressure to the same, sir. Which view is more obvious? As we have seen Mughals weaker in navy, especially when they got shocked by the Pratapaditya's naval power in Bengal.
Thank you, Sudipto. See, I would not, because I talked about so many considerations. Yes, Mughal Bijapuri pressure was one of the key considerations, because that was giving Shivaji an outlet. That is what he realized. He wanted to stay. He wanted to create his mission. So he needed to survive. So that was giving him an alternative. So yes, he could have used if it was well maintained. But I would not say just that. Commerce also, because in the English text also we find that the English agents, they mention that they find Shivaji's ships being loaded with rice and so many other things. They are going to Mocha, Aden, in the Persian Gulf. So that way, yes, commerce cannot be, in fact, discounted. It's not only that he is trading, but the ports which I have talked about, the harbors which I have talked about in the Konkan region, that also attracted good trade. For example, Rajapur, where the British were allowed to have a factory, right? Vengurla, where the Dutch were there. So all these things were there. So it's not only one view that I would say. I would say it's a combination, because he was such a strategist. He was such a kind of a genius that he calculated all the pros and cons and what were more important. And that's why ultimately he assimilated the geographical realities, because he knew that he could master. And that is what I said, that who are controlling his navy, who are the people of his navy, the local people, those who are experts in those things, right? So, and when we talk about the Pratapadityas and all, so I, in fact, before I started the question answer, you can discuss it with me later on, because this is something which is later on when we talk about the Pratapaditya, and there the Shivajis and all these things would not go. But yes, we have more the kinds of harmads that you find in your literature, the dasyus and all these things in the Bengali literature. So you find, so yes, that is a kind of different thing. Yes, but they were there, right?
Thank you, Amarendra. This question comes from Orpita Chatterjee. Who manufactured the Navy ships? What were their specialities? Was there any Western influence in the ship making?
Okay. So who manufactured the ships? Let me tell you, in fact, when we talk about the Europeans also got the ships manufactured with the Indian hands. It is the same thing like the architecture, whether it is the Taj Mahal or the Qutub Minar, the hands were Indians, the concept was from outside, right? So what is happening is that they were the Indian shipwrights, they were the coastal communities, the coolies, Son coolies, that is again for the subcaste. They were the ones who were in fact very much interested. But yes, they are being guided, they are being directed as per the specifications by the designers. And in many cases we find the designers are Europeans, but it should not be meant that the Portuguese are directly helping. There are so many so-called renegades, renegades. That means once they had come here, Portuguese, I told you, 150 years old, so they can go anywhere and they can settle down. So they were, in fact, those who are coming and those who are in fact helping, and of course money. In fact, what we find that so many gunners who were later on used by Kanhoji Angre and all, they were also from Europe, right? So yes, designings, I would say, and I must say, yes, if they were European designers, so obviously the Indian ships, the Maratha ships also benefited from those designs. Particularly that is seen when we come across Kanhoji Angre's period, when he had a huge belt which was planted with teak and all these things, so that he has to have those kinds of teak wood. In fact, during Shivaji's time also, even the mango and the jack wood, that was also used for this thing, shipbuilding. So he was very particular in saying that please ask, request the person who has tendered those trees to give it for the sake of the country and give them proper, you can say, compensation. And if they do not agree, please do not take it away from or against their wishes. So there are so many policies. Yes, as far as designing is concerned, I would say yes, they influence the Indian ship designs gradually.
Thank you, Amarendra. There's no more questions, so I'll take this prerogative as a discussant and ask you a question that's been right at the back of my mind since I was a kid. This is personal because my father, who was in the military engineering service, was posted in Port Blair in the late 1960s, 69, when, this is a reference again to Kanhoji Angre, when two young men from Kolkata, Pinaki Ranjan Chatterjee and George Albert Duke, one was 23, the other was 25, sailed in a small, tiny wooden boat without any sail, without any other kind of mechanics or engine. It was named after the famed Maratha Admiral Kanhoji Angre, and it took them a month to sail from Kolkata to Port Blair. My father was amongst the people who were there to receive them in Port Blair, and then they again sailed back. Now, what is so very interesting is that my father used to tell me this story when I was a kid, and so my desire to know about Kanauji Angre grew, and I started reading not so much about Shivaji or the Maratha Navy, but about Kanauji Angre, and then I realized that there is this alternative discourse that was propounded by the British, that Kanauji Angre belonged to the Siddhi, who came from originally a place called Janji, which basically is from East Africa, where Zanzibar is situated. So this is one argument that kept on cropping up as to how the British tried to take away the power of Kanauji Angre being a proper Maratha, and they put forward this theory that he was not really a Maratha, but he belonged to a subcaste which was not Indian to be specific. They were the Bantus who came from Zanzibar, and also, do you think that, you know, this is also there in 2009? This is again resurrected by the Dutch historians, that the kind of burghers that we find in Sri Lanka, the kind of European and non-Indian influences that went basically behind the Navy. So what is your reading? Is that a reading, because you yourself said that one of the arguments put forward by Shivaji to put forward a Navy is to fight the Siddhi. So do you think that was also the British idea to sort of demoralize and demolish the Maratha unity by putting forward Kanauji Angre as belonging to the Siddhi community?
Thank you for this interesting kind of question. Yes. See, as far as the Marathi sources and documents are concerned, and there are two. There is one very, very good book that by D.G. Dhabu, Kulabakar Angre, and there is one again interesting document and based on the Angre papers, Angre Kalin Ashtagar. So from those documents, it is more or less, in fact, you can say proved that they belong to a place called Angarwadi, that is not very far from Pune. So that is how the family genealogy is being traced. His father, Tukoji Sankapali, yes, I would say, he is in fact, I don't know how British played into this psyche, but he is being portrayed as a one who is very fearsome and having scars on his, I mean, kind of Dasyu kind of look and all. And this is a very fearsome, and he was the one who was there during the time of Kanauji Angre. He was holding the Suvarna Durg fort for Shivaji. So that way, his looks are that way mentioned, that he is very fearsome and this, but I don't think that this actually holds true, that they would belong to the Siddhis because of these kinds of things. Yes, the British had and the Dutch had this particular reason to malign, and in fact, if you read those you can say books and contemporary things, even the British newspapers and magazines, they would always say that Kanauji Angre and they are pirates, right? They're not legitimate. Why? Because there they would try to show that the English company, this is a kind of trading company, and if they are losing by fighting the wars in India, because it is before the Plassey and all, so if they are losing, how would the losses, the economic losses be written off? It is by saying that it is because of this kind of misfortune, the pirates had attacked. So that way pirate factor comes, but this is something maybe that might have been a ploy, yes. But as far as the documentary evidence is concerned, Angarwadi is something where their origin has been traced. Unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you, Amarendra. The next question comes from Professor Swaran Singh from JNU. Great lecture, kudos. How large was Shivaji's navy? Any estimates? What was the period of its peak?
Okay. See, thank you for the question and thank you for showing interest, Professor Swaran Singh. Okay, when we talk about the, you can say, quantum of the vessels, the most conservative of the estimates, and that is as far as the enemy is concerned, and that is from the British, and that comes from 1672. And it says that Shivaji had 160 vessels, right, of different categories. I talked about the Galbat, the Gurabs and the Pals, but obviously this also suggests that some of them are ocean going. That is the Pals probably he's talking about. And then he says, but the others are smaller. But the point I would like to suggest here that this estimate of 1672, if we take that Shivaji started his independent career of rule from 1659 onward, so it's very, 1659 is the year when Portuguese says that, yes, the documents that, yes, Shivaji has founded a navy, the son of Shahaji Muslim. That is okay. So within 10 to 12 years, he has had this kind of navy, and that is something, it is for a purpose. He is talking, the British is, that record is not talking about the assorted things. He's talking about the vessels that is under naval administration. So it is 160, whereas the Marathi authors, they in fact suggest that it was 400. In both there were 200 each. That is what they say. So that can also be there, if you can see that sometimes something could be assorted, but 160, if it is from the British, that is not going to be unbelievable. Secondly, I would also refer to one interesting incident of 1665. That year his Sindhudurg fort was built. 1660, not built, it has, in fact, he had started building. So by 1665, Shivaji had collected so much of navy, or he had become so much of so powerful on the sea, that the Portuguese records mention that Shivaji crossed through Goa, through Malwan, with his fleet, in which he was personally present. See what a kind of leader he was. He was personally present, but otherwise what would happen? That you are afraid of losing your caste. But he was personally present. He passes by, and the Goa people say, so far our, that is Portuguese, our interests are not hampered. We have decided to let him cross. So the Portuguese who had ruled the ocean, who had ruled the Indian kind of scenario for so long, now in 1665, see, within 6-7 years, they are saying like this. That means Shivaji had in fact assorted. Third thing, and the last thing I would like to suggest is that in the English document also, there is a kind of reference, a clandestine thing, that some 50 vessels are lined up at Nagaon. There's a place near Bombay, Thal, and it says that we may consider consigning it to flames. So that is the kind of fear. That means he is gaining his teeth. So these are all between 1670, in the 1670s, that this is all happening. So they are trying to destroy, in fact, thinking of, though they are not directly coming forward. So as far as I am concerned, even when Surendranath Sen also talks about, he goes with the, of course, he's a nationalist historian, he goes with the things that, yes, it seems that 200 each, and that is how his naval, you can say, subas would be, the naval districts would be. But even if it is, I would take, even if it is 160, that is good enough for Shivaji, and he could in fact manage to hold on and did not allow any kind of advantage to the Europeans.
Thank you, Amarendra. The next question comes from Hari Kishan. Sir, does Chanakya Niti also advise something about the Navy system, or for that matter, any other ancient Indian political strategy related scriptures?
See, when we talk about Chanakya Niti, Chanakya of course talks about the warfare and how to fight wars, and in that also the clandestine warfare, how to put the enemy camp on fire without fighting, how to win. Yes. So in that sense, Shivaji's policy was also like that. It was a kind of guerrilla warfare. He knows when to engage, where to engage, and how to disengage. So that way, yes, I would say that yes, he had these kinds of knowledge. So it was, in fact, yes, correct.
Thank you, Amarendra. The next question from Professor Padmini Balaram. You said Khanderi Rock. Isn't it the Khanderi Hills near Mumbai?
Not exactly, ma'am. When we talk about Kandahari Rock, it is way beyond. You have to go take a boat ride and you have to go there. So it is far away from Bombay. It is more than, you can say, 6 to 7 miles from the Bombay harbor. So it would be there. But it was strategically located. That's why Shivaji, in fact, tried to control.
Thank you, Amarendra. There are no more questions. Would somebody like to ask a question? You could sort of put it, type it on the chat box, or raise your hand, or unmute yourself and ask Amarendra a question directly. Would there be a last question, maybe?
Maybe my students would ask me later on the phone.
Yes, yes. And this the series will keep on happening, so you can always check back on the YouTube videos that we'll post very soon. So if there are,
if I may, I'm so happy that the basic thing in this series, and right from the first lecture, it has to be kind of interdisciplinary. It is something which, even if it relates to my subject, it should be enough to create a kind of an idea amongst the non-history people. Otherwise, history, of course, everyone knows the Marathas, every Bengali knows kind of Maratha thing. But yes, that is a very good thing, that if we can try to have a kind of interdisciplinary kind of an approach, like Ranjani, the very first lecture, that was excellent. That is something, I mean, I would have loved to listen to it. And this is my first lecture, and I have said on Shivaji, and if I get another time by chance after the whole circle is over, I would definitely like, as Sandeep Da has said, to talk about Kanoji Andre and all. That's a very, very fascinating feature of the Indian naval history. Yes.
right. Thank you, Amarendra. I see that there's one last question from Kushal Hajra. Were there any prisoners of war taken by the Marathas? If yes, how were they treated? I think this refers to prisoners of war during the naval incursions and excursions.
Yeah. So yes, as I said, Kushal, the prisoners of war, when I said that the basic thing is, it's not simply commerce raiding, it is capturing the enemy ship, getting it to your port, holding the people hostage. And once I say hostage, that means you can say that yes, they can be treated well, but at times they can be thrown into dungeon. Why? Because their demands are not met. So it happens, the treatment depended on the kind of demands which were made, and the political demands particularly that were made, the demands for guns and all these things that were made. So, but initially, yes, they would be treated very well, because they knew, Shivaji knew that he was not going to offend them, because from them only the kind of contributions would be coming as far as his arms and ammunition is concerned. So yes, they would be treated properly, but there are incidences that they had been thrown into prison also, and after 6, 7, 8 years, or maybe they would be left only when the families would be giving them a huge ransom. I hope this suffices.
Thank you, Amarendra. So if there are no more questions, there's a small announcement regarding the Fulbright discussion on the web discussion on the Fulbright programs tomorrow at 3 p.m. It's going to be conducted by Professor Sharbojit Sengupta from Vidya Bhavan. The URL is already uploaded on the Vishwabharati website, and it's also there as part of the Vishwabharati library WhatsApp group. So this brings us to the words of thanks. First of all, the university authorities, primarily the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Vidyut Chakraborty, because originally this was his idea to sort of set forward a platform for young scholars at par with the Vishwabharati lecture series, which is also taking place. So we basically are having 2 to 3 lectures every month. This is our 4th lecture in less than 3 months. So we are averaging more than 1. Of course, the speaker, Dr. Amarendra Kumar, Associate Professor of Department of History. Thank you, Amarendra, for being with us. The members of the Dialogic Vishwabharati Young Scholars Lecture Series, specifically our mentor, Professor Bipasha Raha, Department of History, Dr. Kaushik Ghosh, Assistant Librarian and in charge of the periodical section, Central Library, for hosting us. Dr. Sharon Ishika Maiti, Assistant Professor, Department of Statistics, for introducing the speaker today. And our next speaker will be. Our next speaker will be Dr. Ananda Dr. Gupta of the Department of English, who will speak sometime in the beginning of the next month, early May maybe. And with that, we come to the end of today's lecture series. Would Bipasha like to say something before we wrap up?
Yes, Shudev, thank you. I couldn't have done without you. Thank you so much for hosting this. Organizing this last part of it so wonderfully. And Amarendra, this was an excellent lecture. And I must thank also, as Shudev said, all my committee members for being there with us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So, Kaushik, thank you, Amarendra. Thank you, Bipasha. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.